The dark is wrong. For a heartbeat, you don't know where you are. The ceiling is the wrong ceiling. The sounds are the wrong sounds. And your whole body is soaked through with sweat and rigid as a fence rail. Your heart is trying to break your ribs from the inside. Your legs are seized up. The muscles of your calves knotted so hard you nearly cry out again, cramped as though you've been running for your life, over hills and valleys for miles. But you haven't moved. You're an old man in a bed, far from any hill, and the night is quiet. No one has chased you in 40 years. You lie there and you wait for your breath to come back, and you already know it won't do any good to close your eyes. You know exactly where the dream was taking you, because it's the same place it always takes you. The same place has taken you 1,000 nights since. Your body forgot how to sleep through the dark a long time ago. It forgot on one particular night, in one particular spring, and it has never once let you forget since. You lie in the dark and you let it come, because that's the bargain now. At the end of your life, if you won't look at it in your dreams, you'll see it when you're awake. It was the spring of 1785, and you were young, vibrant, and you were hopeful. And that hope was the most dangerous thing you carried. There were 4 of you, 4 men, heads of 4 families, come down the Ohio from the Redstone settlement back in Pennsylvania on a flatboat, loaded with everything you owned and everyone you loved. You moored her under the high bank at the mouth of the Scioto, where Portsmouth stands now, though there was no Portsmouth then, no anything then, just forest and river and the 2 of them meeting. You knew you shouldn't be there, let's be honest about that, because you were honest about it then, in the quiet, when the women were asleep. That land wasn't open. Congress hadn't surveyed it, hadn't sold it, hadn't said a white man could set a plow in it. It was Indian country, Shawnee land, held by the treaty and by right and by every fire that ever burned on it. You came anyway, 4 of you, and you told yourselves a story to make it bearable, that maybe you'd be suffered to stay, that if you kept your heads down and broke the ground quiet and gave no offense, the killing that had soaked the frontier for a generation might pass you by, that white men and red men might this once simply leave each other be. It was a gambler's prayer, and you wagered your wives and your children on it. You left them at the boat, 4 women, a knot of children, everything soft and precious in your world. The 4 of you headed up the Scioto to see the country. You'd heard about it for years, that valley, from men who'd been through it as captives of the tribes and coming back speaking of it as paradise, and it was. God help you, it was everything they said. Bottomland so rich and level it ached to be farmed. Prairie grass tall as a man. You walked north through it in a long light. 4 men grinning like boys, up to the wide open ground across from where Piketon would someday sit. One of you stopped at a big beech tree near the river, Peter Patrick. A good man, a man you'd trust with your life and nearly had. He took out his knife, and because he was happy, because he was standing in the middle of the most beautiful country he'd ever seen, and he wanted the world to know he'd been there, he carved his initials into the bark. 2 letters, a small human thing to do. You'd had no way of knowing that these 2 letters would outlive every one of you, that they'd still be legible when strangers found them a decade later and hadn't the faintest idea whose name they were. That the creek, the whole township, would carry the ghost of Peter Patrick's good mood on a spring afternoon, long after anyone remembered there even was a Peter Patrick at all. You made camp near the site and you built your fires, and for a few hours you were the happiest trespassers in the history of the world. Then came the dark. You never heard them until it was already happening, and that's the thing no one tells you about, the thing that haunts you worst, the thing that drags you up out of your sleep 4 decades later with a scream in your throat. Just how fast it was. One moment there was firelight and some low talk and the smell of wood smoke. The next there was noise and motion, and Peter, who carved his name 6 hours before, was down, and another one of you was down, and the dark was full of shapes, and your body made a decision your mind was far too slow to make. You ran. You and the last man, you broke for the hills and you ran. This is the part your legs will never forget, the part they're still trying to run tonight. All those years later, in a quiet bed in the dark, the ground tore at you. Branches opened your face, slicing your cheeks and lips. Your heart wasn't beating, it was convulsing, hammering so hard against your ribs you thought it might simply burst and drop you where you stood. Your lungs pulled in the cold night air and it came back out as fire. You ran up, it always seemed up, over one black ridge and down and up the next. You head southeast over ridges to get away from the river valley. You think you're easy prey there, but you still have to get to the Ohio. That might save you. And between you and it, there was nothing but forest and the dark and the men behind you. And here's the truth you'll turn over for the rest of your life, in the quiet years after. You understand those men. Not that night. That night there was only terror. But later, you had come uninvited into their country, in the middle of a war raging for 20 bloody years. They were defending their home, and that frontier had long since stopped being a place where anyone could afford to be gentle. Both sides raided, both sides killed, both sides did things in the dark that no man should carry. You were caught in a war bigger and older than 4 families from Redstone, and mercy had gone out of it a long time before you ever floated down that river. The men behind you were dangerous, because everyone out there was dangerous, because the country itself had been ground down to kill or be killed, and that night you were simply on the losing side of it. But you couldn't think any of that then. Then there was only the running and the burning, and your legs turning to stone beneath you, cramping, seizing, the same cramp that still seizes them in your sleep, and the animal certainty underneath everything that you could not stop. If you stopped, you died. If you slowed, you died. So you didn't. You ran past the point where a body should be able to run, and then you ran past that. because the alternative was lying by a fire like Peter. And you had a wife back at that boat, and children. They didn't know yet. Gosh, they didn't know yet that the world had just ended. You struck the Ohio at the mouth of the Little Scioto, and in the impossible mercy of that moment, there was a boat on the water, a pirogue, a dugout canoe, low and long, white men in it, riding the current down towards the Wabash country. You crashed out of the trees onto the bank and you screamed for them. You begged. You would never beg for anything in your life the way you begged then. Two ruined men with blood and bramble scratch on your faces, waving your arms at the only salvation in 100 miles of wilderness. And they didn't stop. You couldn't understand it in the moment. How can they see you and not stop? But they had their reason, and it was a hard one. And I told you plainly what kind of war you'd stumbled into, because this was a known danger on the river. War parties had learned to force a captured settler to stand on the bank and cry out for rescue, so that the boat would pull ashore and land straight into an ambush. It worked because it preyed on exactly the instinct that makes men worth saving. They pulled to help a desperate stranger. So the boatmen looked at two frantic, bleeding white men shrieking from the shore, and for all they knew, they were looking at bait with a war party waiting in the trees. They made you run. They keep to the current and made you follow along the bank, stumbling, spent, your dead legs somehow finding more, running downriver alongside them while they watched the tree line. They ran you until they were satisfied that no ambush could still be lying in wait, and only then did they bring the pirogue to shore and haul you aboard. You collapsed into the bottom of that canoe and you shook like a man with fever, but you were alive, and half of you wished you weren't, because now came the part that was worse than the running. Now you had to go back and tell the women. They brought you down to the boat at the mouth of the Scioto, to the little settlement, to the 4 women and their children waiting in the dark for their husbands to come home. And 2 of you came back instead of 4. The account written down long after by a judge who heard it from a man who was in that pirogue says the grief could not be described, that its feeling could not be conceived, and maybe it's right that the record stops there, because some things shouldn't be dressed up in fine words. 2 wives were widows, a cluster of children had no fathers, and it happened for a gamble that was never going to pay, a hope of being left in peace, staked in a country at war. There was no time to grieve properly. There was barely time to grieve at all, because you were still exactly where you shouldn't be, in the middle of that war, and safety meant flight, right then, that night. So you gathered up what you could carry and you put off downriver for Limestone, Maysville they call it now, a place with people, a place with walls, a place that wasn't here in the middle of danger. The men in the pirogue left you at Limestone, and that is nearly the end of what anyone knows. After Limestone, the record simply loses the families, whether they lived long or died soon, whether those fatherless children grew up or were scattered to the frontier's thousand small tragedies. No one ever wrote it down, but you know, you lived it. And that's the cruelty of being the one who survives. Everyone else gets to become a story, tidy and finished, and you have to keep carrying it night after night into an old age they never got. Which is why you're awake now, in the dark, an old man with his heart still slamming and his legs still cramped from a run he finished 40 years ago. So that was the first time American settlers tried to hold that valley. It failed, as nearly every early attempt there failed, and it would be a full decade before they came back. And when they did, they came only after the long war had finally been broken, and the tribes with it, at a battle far to the north. That's the hard arithmetic of how the country changed hands. It didn't change because 4 families from Redstone were brave, or because they were right. It changed because a war was won and lost, the way that whole valley was won and lost for thousands of years, with the grief enough to go around on every side of it. And when those later settlers found an old beech tree by the river with 2 letters carved deep into the bark, P.P., they hadn't the slightest idea what it meant. Some long-gone hand, some vanished name. They liked the sound of it, and they gave it to the creek, and to the prairie, and to the whole township. A name that's launched 1,000 jokes, and not one person in 100 who laughs at it knows they're saying the last mark of a happy man who carved his initials in a tree one spring afternoon in 1785, 6 hours before the dark came down and took everything, including his life. His name has outlived him by 2.5 centuries, and today is remembered in PP Township, PP Prairie, and the PP Creek.